Making Accessible Forms the Norm by Matthew Holloway. 10 Years of Alibytes 2022.
Welcome to this talk on making accessible forms the norm. Kia ora, I'm Matthew Holloway from Springload, which is an agency in Wellington, New Zealand. I've been a web developer since about 1996, and I've always had a strong interest in web accessibility and broader issues of digital inclusion. So for those who don't know, Wellington is the seat of government in New Zealand, and so with any public sector organisations there's always a strong interest in accessibility and inclusion, and that's definitely rubbed off on me over the decades that I've been here. So in this talk I'd like to cover three things. First, why do accessible forms matter? So at a conference like Accessibility Bytes, I'd hope we're all fairly convinced that accessible forms do matter, but I'll cover the fundamental purpose of forms and how they're critical to help connect people to services. Second, we'll cover how to evaluate form builders for accessibility. So there are many options out there, of course, and it seems like a very saturated market, but we'll cover ways of judging form builders for accessibility. And finally, we'll cover how important it is to reach people in the languages that they know and the locales that they're familiar with. Why do accessible forms matter? Forms are the text boxes, checkboxes, buttons. They're the part of a website where people provide their own information back, which might be a contact form or a multi-page, multi-step form, what they used to call wizards. Inaccessible forms will prevent people from contacting others or accessing services. Because of this, there's often a legal mandate requiring accessible forms that applies to many governments, public institutions, and increasingly the private sector too. So that could be one reason why accessible forms matter. It can be more customers, more inclusion, a greater variety of ideas. But it's also the right thing to do, I'd say, and it helps make a better society when accessibility needs are met. So, how to evaluate form builders for accessibility? Initially, of course, you might think to look for accessibility compliance statements, WCAG compliance, Section 508 compliance, but this stated compliance is often referring to a subset of features within the form builder. For example, labels are a basic feature that many form builders get right. With high contrast colors and labels, the accessibility compliance statements aren't wrong, but there's so much more to accessibility than that. If we consider accessibility features like a field hint with an area described by a reference, then this is already something that major form builders don't offer. And if your label itself has an acronym or an abbreviation, then it may even fail at labels. Remember, of course, that form builders are ultimately just a way of authoring HTML and CSS. So if we think of HTML as a language, then the vocabulary of accessibility features is controlled and limited by the form builder. Those wishing to use more sophisticated accessibility features can only do so if their form builder supports it. And so accessibility compliance statements alone don't mean that you have access to every accessibility feature. You'll have to dig deeper than compliance statements, which are necessary but not sufficient. Here's how I like to think about it conceptually. Imagine a horizontal line. On the left we have website forms that are basic. They have a limited HTML vocabulary and they're relatively cheap to produce. And on the right we have website forms that are more bespoke, more powerful, able to use more accessibility features, and unfortunately they're more expensive. So we have form builders on the left and we have bespoke app development on the right with all its associated costs. When evaluating form builders, it's worth considering whether you really need a bespoke app. If there is some accessibility feature that a form builder doesn't support, then moving to a bespoke form will mean rebuilding the form from scratch outside of the form builder, which is expensive bespoke development. But it can be the right thing to do for the people using your forms if they need that accessibility feature. However, as form builders become more powerful and include more accessibility features, then what was once expensive bespoke development can increasingly be dealt with through form builders. So I'll give you an example of a trend I've noticed in form builders. If your form builder UI looks like this, or if it looks like this with pages, then it's worth evaluating whether the form builder can go any deeper. Can it support hierarchy? Remember that form builders are essentially a way of authoring HTML, and HTML isn't a flat list, it's a hierarchy, and many accessibility features require supporting that hierarchy. If the form builder doesn't support a deeper hierarchy, then this limits the vocabulary of accessibility features that you can use in HTML, such as field sets. So a very quick test you can do in any form builder is to see whether you can wrap text boxes in field sets. Field sets are a way of grouping related form fields, and they're a way of differentiating form fields with similar labels. A popular example is that of street addresses in the context of being either a postal address or a billing address. The street address fields and labels may be very similar, but they're used in different contexts, and field sets allow us to differentiate these. So, to summarize, yes, look at accessibility compliance statements, but really that's going to be the start of your journey. It helps if you know what HTML you're looking for. If you can have a developer produce some accessible, bespoke HTML and then compare form builders, you'll see how good they are at matching that HTML and what kind of limitations you're going to have to deal with. You'll need to compare the field types that are supported within the form builder, and remember to check whether you're limited to plain text, which reduces your HTML vocabulary, or whether or not you can define acronyms or other types of features. Check to see whether or not the form builder supports error summaries, which are often displayed at the top of forms, and see if it supports headings. However, whether any of these features are necessary for your particular use case, I can't say. If you don't need hints or field sets or abbreviations, then maybe a very simple form builder will be sufficient. But if you're looking for a generic form builder platform, then I'd recommend considering all of these. Finally, multilingualism. The last subject I'd like to talk about is language and localization, which is part of accessibility and inclusion. If a form field label is in a language unknown to a person trying to use it, it is, of course, inaccessible to that person. The concept of localization, or locales, is slightly different to the concept of language, however. Localization, or locales, are about the difference between American English and British English. They're both English, but American English has slightly different expressions to British English. To give another, better example, in New Zealand English, a greeting might be kia ora, which is borrowed from te reo Māori, but in Australian English, the appropriate greeting might be g'day. Making inclusive forms involves communicating to people respectfully in a way that builds trust, and although the greeting example might seem trivial, it can involve that kind of difference. The relevance to form builders is that although forms are often created with a single locale in mind, a form builder providing forms to people should be able to detect the language and locale preferences to allow the people using a form to change this so that they can use the form in a way that suits them. Adding more languages to a form shouldn't necessarily involve recreating the entire form from scratch, when the same field has equivalents across multiple locales. From a programming standpoint, in HTML, locales are set with the lang attribute, and the attribute value, for example, EN for generic English or ENNZ for New Zealand English or ENUS for United States English. Many screen readers, including NVDA, use the lang attribute to affect pronunciation. The Maori language is supported by NVDA, but only when using the lang attribute correctly with a value of MI. So, I didn't have long to cover these subjects, but I hope this talk was useful to share what I've learnt when evaluating form builders and considering multilingualism. Thank you.
Celebrating 10 years, Alibytes 2022.